Thank you for joining me today, and I'm blessed to have as my special guest Steve Skojec, whose website is 1 Peter 5, and I'll put that right here when I edit the video. It's a great Catholic commentary site. I've known about Steve for a long time. He was one of the first Catholics that would give me the time of day years ago. I didn't get much interviews, or nobody was really was willing to talk to me, but Steve did, and I've always thanked him and appreciated that. Thanks, Steve, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on. I'm glad you're doing this. This is cool.
Oh, thank you. I've been wanting to talk about kind of a strange issue. It's I know it's a lot of things that intersect Catholicism, the priesthood, homosexuality, sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. The traditional Catholicism, not necessarily TLM or the traditional Latin Mass, but more conservative Catholicism, abuse cover-up. And I've been wanting to talk about it for a long time with somebody else, because I've discussed it on my website, and I didn't know who. And then on your podcast, and I'll do a link to that too, you did a podcast on your involvement with the Legionnaires of Christ, and I don't know a lot about your story, but I didn't know that you had been involved with them. And I watched, the whole. I watched it a couple of times. It was just excellent. And I said, I'm going to talk to Steve about this, because he's got like real life experience in some of this stuff that I want to talk about. And for people that don't know, the Legionnaires of Christ is a religious order of men, the priesthood. And the founder was, gosh, it's such a bizarre name, Marcial Maciel, correct?
It's almost, the guy's so nice they named him twice, but not really. He wasn't really that nice.
Yeah. When I was doing some research on him, it reminded me of like Duran Duran, the guy from Barbarella, the perverted just. So it was like, okay. Let me give you just a quick, well, you know all this stuff, but the listeners, let me give a quick background on Maciel. Maciel was born in Mexico. He was the youngest of 9 children. There were priests in his family, bishops too. Maciel was abused by his father and brother, verbally, physically, quite harsh. Was beat. He was sent out to work quite young. He was sexually abused by men. As a child, he was expelled. He went into the priesthood. It was kind of a family business, but there was a long history of the clergy in his family. He was expelled from 2 seminaries. He was finally ordained by his uncle, who was a bishop, and then later he founded the Legionnaires of Christ. Could you talk a little bit, Steve, about what the Legionnaires of Christ is? I'm a little bit familiar with them, but you're as people want to listen to your interview, you were quite young when you got involved.
Yeah, I was. And, I haven't been involved with them since 1997. So, it's been 23 years. But I got involved early on. And to give, I guess, a little bit of backstory on how that happened, I grew up in a Catholic family, cradle Catholic. Was going to at the time a small rural parish in Pennsylvania. I was about 14 or 15. And I had started kind of beginning to take my faith more seriously as I was becoming a teenager and contemplating those things more. And I remember just feeling disillusioned by sort of the lex orandi, lex credendi effect in the church. You know, the music was silly, folky music. The
What does that mean,
reverence,
lex corendi? That's Latin. What does that mean?
lex orandi, lex credendi, which is, you know, as we pray, so we believe. This idea of worship and prayer reflecting the beliefs that we have. And I felt that the worship that I was experiencing didn't reflect adequately things like the real presence in the Eucharist. I felt like we were very cavalier about all this stuff. It wasn't very serious. It wasn't very manly. It didn't, you know, as a young man, it wasn't drawing me in. It was pushing me away. And I remember one day kneeling in front of the hideously ugly tabernacle that we had in the church that looked like some sort of weird melting bronze with cutout angels on it, you know, that were from a kindergarten art project. And it was off to the side, you know, because why put Jesus in the center? And, you know, and honestly, it wasn't a knock on the priest we had at the time. Was a really good priest, and he helped me a lot, but it was just this inherited Vatican II watered down whatever, you know. And so I was kneeling there, and I said, Lord, I know I'm supposed to believe you're truly present here, but I don't see any indication that we actually believe that in most of the stuff that we do. So you need to help me find this, because it doesn't make sense to me. So very shortly after making this heartfelt prayer, there was a priest who was related to one of my family members. An uncle by marriage had a cousin who was a priest, and he was in the Legionaries of Christ, and he would come and visit and started taking us on retreats and things like that. And that was my first exposure to Legionaries, because I was looking for more, and he was offering it. And he was a great priest. I mean, to this day, one of the best priests I've ever known. He actually left the priesthood probably 10 years ago after a long involvement with the Legionaries. But during the time that he was in there, he was very much a spiritual father to me, and a very good man. I believe he was authentically a good priest.
How old were you at this?
I was probably 15-ish. I think I was around 9th grade.
So you were 15 and you were actually interested in Catholicism, which is amazing.
Yeah, I was. I mean, and I grew up in a very Catholic family. It was definitely, my mom's side of the family in particular was a very central theme. I grew up around, you know, this same uncle that I'm talking about, grew up around his dining room table, all the guys getting together and talking about politics and the church and all this stuff. And it was very much sort of the nascent forum that the internet, the Catholic internet is today. It's kind of what it was to me then.
Because at 15, the last thing on my mind was the Catholic Church.
Well, I mean, it was a transition point for me. And I hadn't been that interested in it before, but I did, you know, I was an altar boy. I did serve at Mass and things like that. And as I kind of started getting into it, one of the things that actually got me into it more was I was doing stuff, you know, it was the early days of the internet. And I was on BBS forums before that. I was always a computer nerd kind of guy. And so I would get on these forums and I'd see people bashing Catholicism. And I'd be like, well, that's my thing. You know, I'm supposed to know about this. So I'd go grab books. My parents always had tons of books, and I'd start looking stuff up. And I started doing sort of ad hoc apologetics, because I'm like, hey, you're attacking my tribe. What's going on, you know? And because I did that, I was learning about it. And then I went to World Youth Day because my pastor sent me there because he wanted me to be a priest, and he thought it was a big thing.
Was that Toronto? Which one was that?
Denver, 1993.
Oh, that was the kooky one where they had
it was the kooky one. And it was formative for me. It was formative for me because I went to the Diocese of Scranton, and at the time they were.
We have a connection there. Wow.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, because I lived right across the border in New York State. That's where I grew up. And so we were closer to Pennsylvania than anything. So I was at the Diocese of Scranton. I went with them. And when I had gone on the retreat, the pre-World Youth Day retreat at the seminary, the priest was openly questioning Jesus's gender during the Mass. Fun. He didn't want us to kneel down during the consecration. You know, there were immediately red flags, but I'm a kid, you know, and I'm like, he actually said Jesus, he or she, as the case may be. That was the comment that he made that I never forgot. And I was like, who is this Fruit Loop, you know? And then he didn't want us to kneel down during the consecration.
Was it James Martin?
No, it was not. It was not. In fact, I don't remember his name. But no, he was a prototype, I guess, of James Martin.
Was he a Jesuit? No.
No, I think he was diocesan. But there were the seminarians there had girlfriends. Some of them probably had boyfriends. Everything felt really loopy and weird about it. It was nothing like the Catholicism I grew up in a family where my grandparents prayed the rosary every day, and there was a sense of what you were supposed to be doing. It was more than just a cultural Catholicism. It was certainly not this weird, lax, questioning liberal Catholicism that I encountered on this retreat. But I still wanted to go to World Youth Day because I thought it would be cool. I'd never gone anywhere. I'd never been on a plane, I was like, let's do this thing. So I went, and it was weird the whole time. I mean, day one, the roommates that I was assigned met up somehow with some producer from the Howard Stern show.
Wow.
Who couldn't get a room because they were all booked by World Youth Day people. So they invited him to stay in our room.
Oh, fun.
And he was about as pleasant to deal with as one might expect from a Howard Stern show.
I was on his show back in 2013.
Were you really?
Yes.
Yeah, so that was weird and crass, and I spent as much time away from it as I could, and stuff was going on. These guys in the hot tubs every night with the women who were chaperones, and I found out later on that they were priests, and they were just nothing about what was going on made any sense to my understanding of how people were supposed to act as Catholics. So the World Youth Day events were very strange, and I'm on a tangent, so I'll try to wrap it up. But
no wonder you ran to the Legionnaires of Christ.
Well, I mean, it was all very weird, and I found a few guys that I got along with there who all felt the same way I did. This is strange. Things are not the way they're supposed to be. We were all angry at the Stations of the Cross thing that Mother Angelica famously blew up at. I mean, we were furious. We're like, what's going on? In fact, I didn't even see her comments on that probably till years later because, at the time it wasn't like you could look it up on your phone. You had to actually see a tape of something. And so we kind of had this core group that stayed together. The diocese actually pulled out during the papal mass because it was super hot and everybody was getting dehydrated. So the entire diocese got up and left halfway through the papal mass. The reason I came to this thing in the first place. And we stayed. We're like, no, we're not leaving. Like, this is the main event. This is what we're here for.
Oh, man.
So we stayed. They got on buses and went back to the hotel. It's 98 degrees out. And Cherry Creek State Park is desert. It's hot and it's dry. And all these tents are filling up with people who are dehydrated and they've got them on IVs and all this stuff.
Oh.
So we stay, we do this. And there's like 300,000 people that, and we get through the mass. And then we had to walk all the way back 10 miles to the hotel after all, being out there in the heat and all. It was just ridiculous. But it was a formative experience for me because I said, all right, there's clearly two different kinds of Catholicism, at least now that I know about, the one I grew up with and this. But I also knew that there were people who really did believe in it. And if it was only a few of us, it was something. So there was a seed there.
Oh, you could process that at that age. See, I'm older than you. So, but our stories are similar because I grew up in San Francisco in the Bay Area.
Right.
And in the 70s and the early 80s, when, my parents were actually forcing me to go to church and stuff and forcing me to go to Catholic school. I mean, it was the folk guitar mass, and we've talked about this, and the St. Louis Jesuits, and holding hands with the priest around the altar during the consecration. So I was turned off by all that as well. And that was you just used the you used this term just now, but you also in the interview that I'm going to link to, a masculine type of Catholicism, which you didn't see, and I certainly didn't witness when I was a boy.
And as a boy, you don't really even know that that's necessarily what you're looking for, but you're just like, this is weird. I don't like it. In the same way that I would have said, I'm not going to wear a pink dress. You didn't need somebody to tell me it was weird. I didn't watch My Little Pony. I mean, nobody had to tell me that. It was just like, this is not appealing to me.
Yeah. This is going to build into hopefully our conversation, is that to certain young men, especially like me, who felt quite alienated, and quite distant from any forms of masculinity, and that's a long story. I think I could instinctively sense that the Catholic Church was lacking that.
Sure.
And I didn't have any other avenues at that time in the early 70s, the late 70s, early 80s within Catholicism. It was all guitar mass, you know.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
TLM, I guess, was somewhere. I don't know where it was. But so my interest, you know, swerved toward pop culture because I could see masculinity there, even like with the Village People.
Hmm.
So the Catholic Church, I didn't regard at all from my teen years.
I mean, it wasn't something to be taken seriously, honestly. And I'm fortunate because of the family that I grew up in, because the parish priest I had was a very elderly, incredibly reverent priest,
Wow.
despite the fact that they were guitar masses and everything. I mean, the way he handled the Eucharist and the words of the consecration was inspiring. You knew something serious was going on. He took extreme care in cleaning, you know, fragments off the paten. There were just little things that, as an altar boy up close and personal, I saw him doing, and I was like, okay, this means something to this guy, you know.
I had that a little bit, and I wrote about it in my book too. Is that for a short time I was an altar boy, and there was sort of a small window when there was an older Irish, rather crusty, you know, rigid priest at our parish, and he, you know, ran the altar boys like a military, and actually that was quite good for me at the time because it was this was like 7th, 8th grade. It was like the only time when I could interrelate with other boys and there wasn't like a lot of teasing or anything going on, because by then I had gravitated toward the girls and everything. But then this was in that middle period when it was a lot of switchover from just altar boys to altar girls, and then, but this had already been building, where you had female lectors, female Eucharist ministers, and everybody was in the sacristy, where before that was kind of like more of a male only area, zone. And then it changed. Everybody left, and I left, and it was pretty much over. And
it was a weird time. And so, I mean, and the reason I tell this unrelated story as the backdrop to my introduction to Legionaries of Christ is what attracted me to them was the masculinity that I saw. It was the reverence and the structure and the order that I saw. You know, these guys they all wore cassocks. My interactions with them were the first time I'd ever seen somebody hold up the host at the elevation for a long period of time in adoration. A lot of times you'd go to mass and it was just like up, down, there you go, like blink and you'll miss it, you know, and these guys would hold the host up during the adoration, you know, for adoration during the consecration.
I didn't experience that till the TLM.
Yeah. Well, and so I think that there was at the very least within the Legionaries, there was a superficial orthodoxy of aesthetics that appealed. So the cassocks, that it was the first time I ever saw incense at a mass. It was the first time I ever heard Gregorian chant. It was the first time I saw adoration and benediction. The guys that I met with these retreats we would go on were at the minor seminary when I was at that age, which was up in New Hampshire, and it was for 9th through 12th graders. And the boys who were there were very kind and charitable, but they knew their faith, and it was a very welcoming environment. And I felt like, hey, this is cool. You know, I have a place here. It made Catholicism seem like something that was worth doing.
Doable, yeah.
Yeah.
You said something, in the interview that I really liked. You said, we were there because we wanted more from a church that wasn't offering these things to us, and we thought we identified them from within. So, I mean, that's what drew me to the TLM.
Sure.
Is that I was pretty desperate. I had returned to the church. I was going to give it one last stab. Hated it because it hadn't changed since I was a boy. Mm-hmm. You know, except you had liturgical dancing. To me, it was worse in the Bay Area, at least.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
Yeah, and then there were a lot of priests that I was trying to. I wanted them as a spiritual director, and they were telling me to go back to the life, to meet somebody, settle down, and blah, 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 blah. So that's what drew me. It sounds like that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like that's what drew you too, although you were much younger. And
I mean, I was on a trajectory to the TLM and I didn't know it. What I was finding were aspects of what the TLM had to offer that I had never seen before. I wasn't, the West Coast in particular in this country, but not only. I mean, there were places in upstate New York, like the Diocese of Rochester and stuff, that were really bad.
Yes.
I was more ensconced in sort of this atmosphere of aggressive mediocrity. I mean, it was really aggressively lukewarm, but it wasn't, it wasn't Seattle and the clown masses or what you were seeing in the Bay Area. I mean, those horror stories came filtering in through, The Wanderer and things like that into my family, but I didn't see most of those things in person. It just wasn't anything worth spending your time on. Why give your life to this thing? It's boring, it's dull, it's effeminate, it's not interesting. I'd rather be doing just about anything else. That was the feeling that I kind of was having. Yeah. And then I found this thing that was like, no, look at this. It's noble. There's structure. There's engagement here. It's interesting because I played sports, but I've always been this big, clumsy guy. Football was my best sport because I was big enough to push people around, but I was not coordinated. I stunk at athletics. And so for the Legionaries, one of their big appeals to men was they did a ton of sports. And that always drew guys in who loved to play because they had all these very young, athletic, competitive guys who were out there playing soccer, playing football, doing whatever. That was never a draw for me. For me, it was the orthodoxy, weirdly. I was kind of a nerd about that.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about my story too much, but I just want to mention something and then attach it on to what your experiences were. Now, I came back to the church in '99, and then it's kind of nuts. And 6-7 months later, I was back in the Diocese of Scranton in Northeast Pennsylvania with these priests who were I don't want to get into it. They were former SPX priests. So I actually made a little visit. Is it in was it Cheshire?
Yeah, Cheshire. Cheshire is the major seminary for the United States.
Okay, and I had no knowledge of the Legionnaires of Christ, the LC priests, but I made a visit there. I have to say I was very impressed.
Yeah.
It was. I don't want to be gross, but it was kind of like a gay man's fantasy of a seminary. The guys were young, quite good looking.
They always made sure they were handsome. They didn't recruit the ones who weren't.
Okay,
that was a thing.
Okay. You said it. I didn't. Okay.
No, so, I heard it. I heard them talking about it.
I mean, that was my impression. And that was an impression of a guy with SSA, kind of the same, very, cropped haircut, very neat.
Yep.
Clean, not a lot of facial hair. It was just a high proportion of good looking men, cassocks. And I was like, I'm impressed. But people didn't seem vain or narcissistic.
And that's what it was designed to do, by the way, Joseph, was to impress. Okay. It was designed to draw people in because, again, it was superficial. It was aesthetics. It was look at this thing that's beautiful and give us your money. Yeah. Give us your money and give us your kids.
Oh, boy. So on the group that I was with, I think it was almost like that on a smaller scale because the guys they're all former SSPX priests, Society of St. Pius X. They were all young, quite good looking, very well kept, always wore the cassock.
This was the Society of St. John, right?
The Society of St. John in Scranton, and I was there for 2 years, and so I mean that's what you saw, but you're coming from a different perspective because you're a straight young man,
right?
So, but did that still impress you? I mean, it looks great.
Yeah, it is impressive. I mean, as a guy, you want to be a part of something that's like that. It feels good to be part of some elite group. It feels good to be, considered good enough or whatever. I don't think you as a young man you consciously recognize the aesthetic of the fact that these guys are all handsome, but hey, I'm one of these guys. That says a good thing about me, on a subconscious level. I have to imagine there's something there.
Yeah.
The true, the good, and the beautiful have their own allure, even when you're not contemplating it directly, I think. And so they used those aspects to try to bring people in. Now, the question you originally asked me that I have a hard time knowing how to answer is, what is the Legionaries of Christ? What are they? I don't know how to explain that to you. And over the time that I spent with them, I became less and less certain what their actual mission was, other than their own self-aggrandizement. It seemed to be I used to compare them to the Borg from Star Trek. They would just assimilate people in. and they were like a viral marketing thing. Everything they did had to do with, how do we increase the amount of money we have? How do we increase the number of vocations we have? How do we get more people in the organization? Just keep building, 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 building. And it was all inwardly focused. And we would do things like missionary work, and ostensibly we would do these missions. There was a front organization called Youth for the Third Millennium that was a legionary run organization. And I did a bunch of different missions with them, and we would go to different countries, which was appealing because, go travel somewhere, you'd go door to door, and you try to get people to come back to their local parish, and you got to practice your apologetics, and it made you learn your faith more. And all of that was very appealing. But it wasn't until the last mission that I did, where I was actually the mission director.
Right.
And I'm sitting in one of these meetings. So the lay movement that is associated with the Legionaries of Christ is called Regnum Christi.
Yeah, it's like a third order, a secular order.
It is. Yeah. And so Regnum Christi would have these meetings for its own members that would always be separate from whatever thing the Legionaries did, where they were trying to, work with people who weren't part of it. And so they would market these missions, and they would draw in Catholic youth, and then they would try to recruit them into Regnum Christi while they were there. And I'll never forget sitting in this meeting. I was already on my way out. I was already done with the Legion. I had already had issues, and I needed to go.
How old were you here?
I was 18 or 19, I think.
Okay.
This would have been January of 1997, so I was 19. And I was the mission director for this mission. I'd put the whole thing together. We were in Miami, and I'd been there for a couple of weeks. And this priest who I'd known for a long time, we're having this Regnum Christi meeting, and he said, if you're not here, he looks around the room, he goes, if you're not here to recruit people to Regnum Christi, there is something wrong with you. And I was like, that's weird, because when I put this thing together, I was pretty sure it was to bring people back to church. I don't really care about bringing people to Regnum Christi. But it struck me really hard that recruitment is the mission of the Legionaries. They don't have a charism. They just make more legionaries. That's what they do, like a virus.
That's familiar. This was part, and you segued into it without knowing that that's what, where I kind of wanted to go. Is it when I was listening to your story, because I've always been fascinated by cults.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been fascinated by cults probably since I was in like the biggest cult in the world, which is the LGBT cult.
Sure.
So, but nobody knows this cult.
No, I wouldn't have thought of it that way. That's another conversation we'll have to have sometime. This leads into your story, and I want to ask you about this too. This is something that Randy Schultz said back in 1993, for people that don't know, although I've talked about him a lot. He was a gay journalist in San Francisco. He wrote the book And the Band Played On, which was about the AIDS crisis in the 80s. He wrote, if I criticize the gay community, then I'm part of the establishment. I sold out. Rather than just having a different opinion, there's no room in the gay community for people of good intention having different opinions. Either you have the opinion or you're nothing. He said that in 1993 to the New York Times. And what I've always, how I distinguish a cult from other things, like a legitimate religion, is that when you leave a cult, how are you treated? Right.
As an ex-member. And you talked about that, because like as an ex-gay guy, you are treated, just today I got horrible emails just attacking me, just
sure,
nonstop. And then when you left the Legionnaires of Christ, you kind of experienced what you did.
Yeah. So, to do a quick fast forward to how I got from being super involved to how I left, it was a span of really just a couple of years where it accelerated. I would do these retreats for a couple of years back in upstate New York. I started leading one of their youth groups. They loved to make you feel like you were a leader and you were important, and they would put you in charge of something that really didn't matter, or that you weren't really in charge of, but you felt like you were, and that made you feel good about yourself. And it got you more integrated. They like to use this word integrated, where, you start to think and see things the way that the movement does. Lots of buzzwords,
Can I ask you something real quick?
Yeah.
Just before I lose it, because this is really important. And feel free not to answer. I know that I got involved with the Society of St. John because I was really lacking something and looking for something. I was looking for like masculine affirmation, which I never got as a kid. And like you said, that it was, encased in this facade of Catholic orthodoxy and beauty and everything. That appealed to me. when when you were young, was there something that, like, in hindsight, that was maybe lacking in you that drew you
Yeah.
to the
Yeah,
Legionnaires
absolutely.
of Christ?
No, I
That
think
you
I
needed
was
from
looking
them.
for paternal affirmation for sure. My dad is a really quiet guy, and always, he had a lot of problems with his temper when he was younger and things like that. He just really struggled to relate to me. I knew he loved me, but it was weird. Like, we would sit in the car. I used to work with him, and we'd sit in the car on the way to work, and I'd try to talk to him, and sometimes I'd get like a grunt in reply. That was it. You remember the Wonder Years, the dad on the Wonder Years? You ever watch
Yeah,
that
I do.
show? Yeah, that's who he
Very
reminded
little,
me
but
of,
I do remember it. Yeah.
And it's like, we have a much better relationship now, but he was going through a lot of stuff when he was young. He got married young. He had me very young. He was 24 when I was born, and my mom was 19. They were really, really
Wow.
young. And so,
So in a sense, you were I don't want to put words in your mouth. You were looking for a bit of a father figure.
in a way, yeah. I
And
was like, and I wanted to be praised, and I wanted to be affirmed, and I wanted, all that stuff.
I didn't know that.
And it's very easy to map that onto priests. I've talked to lots of people who've done that.
Totally.
And so I think that's what I was looking for. And I was looking for a sense of purpose because I didn't have one.
And then I want you to get back to your story. I feel like I'm interrupting you, but there's a gay historian I really like named Michael Bronsky, and he talked about why a lot of young men were drawn or are drawn to the gay community. It's a sense of brotherhood, and I think you see that in these religious orders, specifically like the one I was in, but on a bigger scale. The LCs, the Legionnaires of Christ.
Yeah. I mean, being accepted, being part of something. The psychology of being part of an in-group is very difficult to overstate. It is a profound and intoxicating feeling. It's the same thing you have when you're on a team. You're on a football team, and maybe you didn't score all the touchdowns, but you played some role, and you feel like that victory belongs to you as well. That team aspect is it's a critical part of who we are, I think.
And in Western society, except for sports, there really isn't that all-male zone. And in Catholicism, like, what I know, people say the Knights of Columbus, and God bless them, but it seems like it's an older group, and they're all involved in
it never appealed to me.
Selling insurance and stuff, and wearing the funny hats and everything. So there isn't much. So that's why I think some of these TLM movements, although most of them are good, I think there is a danger in some of them, like the one I was in and the LCs, that it can draw in a certain kind of young man and boy, and you weren't abused, physically.
No, I was never abused.
It'll set you up for other kinds of abuse.
Sure. Absolutely. Psychological, emotional abuse, definitely.
Go ahead, back to your story.
I was subjected to that. So, okay, so to breeze through this so that we can get out to the other side of your question, I became more and more involved over the years. And then the priests who had been taking us on the retreats got transferred, because they always get moved every few years in the Legion, and it's an international organization, so you never know where they're going to go. And he got sent to Texas, and he called me up that summer. It was summer of 1995, and he said, "We're doing a mission in Colorado. Do you want to go?" And I was like, I just went to Colorado for World Youth Day. If I'm going to travel, I think I'm going to go do something else. And I was working, I always worked as a kid. So I had a summer job, and I didn't want to give up the money. And I was like, I don't know. So then he calls me back like a week later, and he says, "Okay, I got another one. There's a summer camp we're doing for Mexican boys in Texas." And it was, I can't remember how he sold it to me, but it was way more appealing because it was a bunch of rich Mexican kids who are always big benefactors for the Legion. And so they would do these summer camps for them where, I mean, it was like, I don't know, it was like a shopping spree type of event where we did nothing but go to Six Flags, and we went out to medieval times for dinner, and we literally took them shopping at the mall. I mean, we went to like 3 different Six Flags in a week. I mean, it was just a party for kids for a week. Nothing weird went on. It was just, I guess we were making their parents happy because they gave money. I don't really even know what the backstory was on it, but it was appealing enough to me because I'd never been to Texas. I'm like, yeah, I'll go. And I went down there. I was 17. I was homeschooling for the first time in my life. I'd gone to public school my whole life. I had homeschooled that year, and I hated it. I had nothing to do, and I was bored. And I was like, I'm ready to go somewhere, anywhere. I need to get out. So I went down to Texas, and they have a school there. Actually, they still do, called the Highland School. And I stayed there. But the first day there, I met the nephew of this priest, and he and I immediately became best friends. We just hit it off. It was like we were born from the same brain. We quoted the same movies. We talked about the same cultural stuff. Like we just instant bond like I'd never experienced before. So, I had transitioned out of public school because I saw I was on a not good trajectory there. It was not helping my spiritual life, which was beginning to blossom. And then I did homeschool and I hated that. And I was like, I could have a friend who shares the same beliefs as me and we could have fun. Like, this is totally new for me. This is appealing. So I did this summer camp and I went home after talking to the priest there, and I had worked something out with them where they were willing to let me go to the school tuition free and live there in the building because it had been a boarding school, and the boarding thing had ended because there was an economic crisis in Mexico and they couldn't afford to run the Mexican side of the school anymore because it was a boarding school for Mexican kids to come up and study in the United States, and they had to shut that down. So they had all these rooms available, an entire floor of empty bedrooms. And it was like, yeah, you can stay here. You can help with the youth groups. You can do chores around the place, and we'll let you come to the school. They were recruiting me. I didn't know it. I just wanted to go have an adventure and finish school somewhere with a friend. And, so I went home. I told my parents I really want to do this. And being the headstrong guy that I was like, I know I'm only 17, but I'm going to be 18 in a couple months and I'm going. So I hope you'll give me your blessing, but I need to do something different. I need to make a change. So I went and I had my senior year there. I made friends there that are still friends to this day. I mean, there were some very positive aspects of what I did while I was there. Some of my best friends now were friends I made that year. But, over the course of the year and doing a bunch of missionary work and being involved in a youth group and all this stuff. So I graduate from high school and they talk me into doing this thing that they have called the coworker program. And what it is it's based on, how the Mormons do the 2 years of missionary service and they go out and they do all this stuff. Well, that's what that was. It was the Catholic version.
You have to wear a white shirt and a tie.
I did not.
Right.
I did not. And I didn't have to use the title of elder either, which was nice. Okay. But that's what it's based on. And so, we all had this retreat where we got together that summer before we went to go do our coworker year. And during that time, I was prevailed upon and vocationally pressured to join their seminary discernment program. I only lasted a few days because I was gnawing my own leg off. I did not want to be there, but they told me they knew I had a vocation and I was susceptible to that. So I gave it a shot and it just wasn't working. And they saw that I was actually creating a disturbance in the force of their carefully cultivated, brainwashed candidates by me being a very verbose guy who just talked about, I don't like this. And I don't want, and it was like, I was upsetting the crowd. So they pulled me out and they sent me to Atlanta. And while I was in Atlanta, I had a girlfriend in high school that I was trying to get in touch with. And it's a convoluted story, but basically she was in psychiatric counseling for something that had happened to her when she was a child.
Sure.
And I was trying to get in touch with her. But everything that happens with members of the movement happens through members of the movement. So she wasn't seeing a psychiatrist just anywhere. She was seeing a Regnum Christi psychiatrist, and it's like, it's all incestuous the way that they do it. And so the priest, who was the superior of the house that I lived in, found out that I had been trying to locate her and contact her. And he gets involved and he's like, look, I need you to be focused on what you're doing here. I started teaching religion at their school, which is kind of dumb because I was an 18-year-old high school graduate and they had me teaching 7th and 8th grade religion.
Wow, okay.
at their academy. Now, I was pretty good at it, but, you don't usually put an 18-year-old in that position. It's not always the best idea. He's like, we need you to focus on what you're doing. Technically, I was allowed to contact her according to their rules, but they really didn't want me doing it. And so he's like, I know this psychiatrist. I know him really well. So I'll talk to him and, I'll coordinate something. And then basically what he started coming back to me with is, psychiatrist says you can't talk to her because it's going to set her back in her therapy and all this stuff. And she needs to be totally focused on this. And he was just lying to me. And I didn't know it until later when I finally got out and I talked to her and she's like, none of that ever happened. But he was manipulating me in spiritual direction to get me to do what he wanted me to do. And because I was the obedient little Catholic who wanted to make the priests happy because it meant the world to me that they thought highly of me, I did what I was told. And finally, after, this is a very truncated version of this, but finally, I was able to break free of that, and started to see talking to more and more people that I knew around the country who were working, and a lot of my friends, many of whom I had recruited myself because I was the first young men's Regnum Christi team captain in the United States. They were really just getting going at that point here in the U.S. And, I brought a lot of people in and I started talking to them, and they were having all the same problems that I was. They were feeling manipulated. They were feeling guilty. But they had cultivated this culture of, you don't talk about this stuff. You don't complain about it. You don't criticize anybody up the chain of command.
It's a sin.
So everybody felt like they shouldn't talk about it, but I wasn't good at following those rules. And then I found out that it was a universal problem.
Yeah.
So now I'm trying to remember what the question was that led me down this road that you asked me, because I was trying to get you through where I got out.
Well, we were talking, you went back to my original question.
Oh, I know what it was.
What is the Legionnaires of Christ?
But you asked me about how they treat you when you're gone. That was what it was.
Exactly. A cult, I define a cult by how they treat you when you leave. You just
okay,
go
so this is what happened.
Yeah.
And this is a very interesting story. So I came home from Atlanta that Christmas, the Christmas of 1996. I had just turned 19. I had been working for months on preparing this mission in Miami that I was telling you about that was happening the following January. I got home. I was riddled with vocational anxiety. I had been told by multiple priests within the Legionaries that they knew I had a priestly vocation. I didn't want one. I thought I was still in love with this girl that I had fallen in love with in high school, and her family was deeply involved. Everybody but her was actually a religious in the Legionaries. It was all very...
Did you tell them that you were having second thoughts about the priesthood?
Yeah, well, I did. I mean, I told them that I was struggling with it. It wasn't what I wanted, but they had this way of, and there's a book out there.
But they kept pushing you that direction.
They kept pushing, but there's a book out there that was written by their, at the time, territorial director for the entire North American area. His name was Father Anthony Bannon. And he wrote this book called Peter on the Shore. And I remember there being a section in that book where it says, if you don't think you have a vocation to the priesthood, if you want to get married, if blah, 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 all these things, that's just a sign that you really do have a vocation, and if you don't give God what he wants, you're going to be miserable and all this stuff. And so it plays on the guilty conscience of me in particular, because I was scrupulous. Mm-hmm. I felt trapped between God wants me to do this thing I don't want. There's this other thing I do want, but if I do it, I'm never going to be happy. And I was just agonizing over it. I couldn't let it go. So I had gotten to the point where I didn't know what to do. I come home for Christmas, and there's a new pastor at my parents' parish. I'd never met him. And I went to daily mass, and he comes out to me after mass and he says,
Diocesan priest?
Diocesan priest. He says, can I talk to you for a minute? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And he's like, actually, you willing to just come out to breakfast with me? And I was like, okay. So we go out, and he's like, I don't know how to explain this to you. But sometimes I have these weird spiritual insights. And today I tried to leave the church, and God told me I needed to come talk to you about what you're doing. And I was like, okay. And so he kind of asked me, what was going on with the Legionaries and everything like that, because he knew some from my parents.
Yeah, I bet.
And I told him.
Were your mom and dad worried about you at this time in the LCs or no?
If they were, they didn't tell me.
Okay.
They told me later that they had some concerns because our family had been involved with yet another cult that ran a retreat center in Connecticut and lured a lot of people in. And the guys supposedly had all these visions of Christ and all this stuff. And it was a big thing for a while. It was called the Apostolic Center. And then at some point, the guy says to his inner circle, Jesus wants me to share communion with you homosexually. Like we're supposed to have these homosexual relationships. Wait.
Somebody said that to you?
This was a cult that my family had gotten involved in. My extended family, cousins and grandparents and everybody would go to these retreats. Was not. But because my parents had seen that this had happened and that some guys had actually been so brainwashed that they went along with this guy, other guys were like, what the heck, and lost their faith. I mean, it was a huge falling out, family and friends. It was a big deal. I was too young to remember that, but they remembered it. And when they saw some of the things that the Legionaries were doing, they said, and again, they didn't tell me until later because I was happy.
Yeah.
And they said, this reminds me of that, but they weren't sure.
Whoa.
And so they didn't tell me that until I was an adult. And I was like, could you have maybe said something so that, but I can understand. I mean, it made a difference in me. I was a difficult kid. And here I was, and I cared about religion, and I cared about going to mass, and I was very persuasive and charismatic about what a great thing it was that I was involved in. And I'm kind of a force of nature in my home, and they're like, I don't know what to say. You know, he seems like he's doing well. He's not complaining about anything. Maybe it's fine.
And it's Catholic, you know.
And it's Catholic.
And it looks good.
It does. And so anyway, this priest talks to me during breakfast, and I start talking about how I have all this vocational anxiety and I don't know what to do, but it's getting to the point where I can't live with it anymore. And he's like, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. He's like, I feel very strongly that you need to leave. You really need to get out of there. It's not good for you.
Oh.
And that was the impulse that I had to tell you that, but I didn't want to say it until I heard your side of the story. And I was like, welp, that sounds good to me, because I don't want to do this anymore. It's destroying me. So I went home that day and I sent a letter to my superior at the house down there. And it was a it's not you, it's me type letter, you know?
Oh yeah.
Where I was like, look, I appreciate the fact of all the involvement, but
you were trying to leave on good terms.
Good terms. I'm killing myself with vocational anxiety.
Yeah.
I can't handle it. I need to step away from this because it's making it miserable for me to live.
For no whistleblower.
No.
No.
And it was very cordial, and almost immediately they began trying to turn everyone I knew against me.
You in your interview said it was a campaign against.
It was a campaign. I mean, they called my girlfriend's mother. They called my friends' mothers. My friends who are still working with the Legionaries, they were approaching them and saying, oh, you don't know the real story about Steve. And these were really tight friends that I had, luckily, because they were good friends. They were like, go pound sand. I don't believe anything that you say. But I mean, they were trying a whisper campaign to make it look like I was some skeezy, disloyal, not generous. Generous is one of their buzzwords. Like, if you're generous, you're really engaged in all of the things of the movement. Well, I was not generous enough. One of my friends, the one who was with me in Atlanta, he said the priest told him, imagine it's like you're in battle and you're marching up a hill, and one of your fellow soldiers falls in battle. He's like, you don't stop to pick him up. You have to keep going. My friend's like, I thought it was No Man Left Behind, but maybe I'm wrong. But it was just like, so they were just doing what they could to try to turn everyone against me and close ranks, because I think they knew that I was going to start figuring out I had been manipulated, and that was going to be a problem. And it's always been the danger for them, because they say they recruit leaders, but when they recruit real leaders who actually say, you know what, you guys are full of it and I'm turning against you, that creates massive liabilities for them. And there were a lot of us that year. Almost all of my coworker class wound up leaving before the end of their terms, or leaving on bad terms,
right? Because
they all started seeing through it. And then we all wound up at Steubenville together for some reason. Some of it because we just knew each other, but a ton of us wound up there. And Steubenville is the anti-legionary, you would think. I mean, it's charismatic and it's all this stuff. So it felt like a safe haven, but they showed up there and they were recruiting hard. The whole time I was there, from 97 to 2001, and I fought them tooth and nail the whole way, because I just became increasingly convinced any organization that does this stuff systemically, I was not the only one dealing with it. The more testimonies I collected, the more I saw that everybody was being treated the same way. It was a very utilitarian thing.
Yep.
And I said, if this is what they're doing, it has to be corruption that goes to the top. It has to be. And by this time, by the way, I was aware that there were accusations against Maciel, and I didn't necessarily believe them. I didn't believe the sexual abuse accusations. I didn't have a reason to, but I knew you couldn't have systemic failure that looked exactly the same everywhere you went unless it was built into the pedagogy of the order.
I think because at that time too, I think technology was helping, let's say, ex-cult members.
Yes.
Because like when you're in a cult, like I was, let's say I was in a gay cult, you don't know about, and I was in it for a long time. So it's probably difficult for you to leave the LCs because you invest time in it. You invest energy, you generally like what you're doing.
I'd lived in community with the priest for almost 2 years. And
all of your friends are usually in it,
know. Yeah,
so,
everybody.
Yeah. So like when I had to leave gay, it's tough because you're leaving everything.
You basically have to start a whole new life.
Exactly. And before the internet, you're kind of like, I don't know what to do. but at least now people who are like leaving gay, they've seen, maybe my testimony or other
Yeah.
people's. But like the actress that left Scientology, she's really cool.
Leia Ramini or
Leia
Ramini?
Remini. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she talked about how technology really helped people who were in Scientology because they got more information, people that left. And I think that might have helped LC people.
It did later. I mean, for me, it was a little too early. If you think about it, internet really didn't even start becoming widely available until mid 90s. I had it earlier than that. People, when I was in college, everybody's on dial-up. You had to go to the computer lab if you wanted any kind of connection that was worth anything.
I know.
So these forums, these ex-legionary forums, they did start popping up, I think, during the time I was in college, but they weren't widely accessed because the internet just didn't look like it does now.
No. Like in '99, when I left gay, and I was looking for a TLM group. I was just doing cursory searches, and the Society of St. John had it very splashy. They were very, at the time, high tech, and they had a great website with pictures of them, and it looked great. And that's one of the reasons why, I think the FSSP's website at that time was much more rudimentary. It was kind of like a Drudge Report website.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
They weren't going full swing. But one other thing that I wanted to ask you about too, do you think that as a young man, if you were you sound like you were, though, a pretty strong character. Do you think if you maybe would have been in a different place, in a different mindset, different headspace, do you think you wouldn't have gotten involved with the Legionnaires of Christ?
It's a really interesting question.
It's hard to, I know, I'm asking you to self-analyze.
No, I mean, I think it's a fair question. It's hard to say because it was a multifaceted motivation that I had. I wasn't conscious of the need for paternal affirmation. No kid, I don't think, is.
Not that young, no.
No. I just knew it felt good when these priests, who I had been, raised my whole life to think priests were
exactly
pretty much the paradigm of who you should respect in the world. And they thought the world of me, and they saw me as a leader, and they treated me as though I was important, and they put me in charge of things, and all of that felt great. But there was also the fact that in my entire life, I had never seen Catholicism practiced in any way that resembled those traditional time-honored forms that we've since discovered in the traditional Latin Mass. And this got me about half of the way there. And it was beautiful to me, and it was attractive. And leaving the Legionaries would have put me in a position where that was all I had to go back to, was the thing I had already deemed sufficiently inferior that it was threatening my faith, and I was trying to get away from it. How do you go back to that? And then you add to that, the fact that the Legionaries teach you that they're the foot soldiers of Christ, and that they're the elite in the church, and that none of the other bishops and priests are formed well, and all this stuff. So you get to a point where,
they're right there.
You get to this point where you can't figure out how to be Catholic without being a member, because this is good. Like, you've progressed to this point. Why would you want to go back? And so you go home and you feel like there's nothing but inferiority everywhere you look, and it alienates you from the church. And I remember the way I described it back then, when I was a teen or in my early 20s, is I don't know how to get to God without going through them. Like, he just felt very distant and far away from me. And to go back actually to the question that I was answering before, I actually had one of the priests who I knew very well send a message to me through an intermediary when I was at Steubenville to say to me, the Legion owes you an apology for what they did to you, but they're not going to come to you. You have to come to them. How's that for messed up and manipulative?
Yeah, I can't figure that out. No.
It was this, like, you're now a rogue agent and you're out here on your own. And if you want to have us tell you that, we did anything wrong, you're going to have to come back into the fold, because they wanted to contain me. Because I became a dynamo of anti-legionary propaganda when I was at college. I mean, it gave me purpose that helped to fuel all the anger and anxiety and everything that I had because I still had vocational anxiety all through college. And it gave me something to do. And I saw them recruiting on campus, and I made sure I talked to everybody I could who did it and said, stay away, because this is what they're going to do to you, and this is what they did to me. And they got to the point where they would actually tell new recruits, don't talk to him. Like, talk to anybody else. Don't talk to him. And that just told me I was effective.
Wow. Well, because I have thought about this too, going back to the question that I asked you about if I had been different. And I think if I would have gotten affirmation and love, felt secure as a boy, I mean, I definitely, because I was molested as a boy by priests. And I think predators know instinctively, the ones that have a lot of practice at it,
yeah,
they have it down to a science. I mean,
no, they do. And they're very good at building coalitions of people who have no reason to believe they're anything but what they appear to be, noble, upstanding individuals.
So the priest that preyed upon me knew I would be an easy target, and I was, and I never said anything. But at those days, nobody, did. So, or very, very, very few. So I think if I would, and I'm not blaming anybody, but I think if I would have been a stronger, more secure, if I hadn't have been so sensitive, so needy, incredibly needy, and that overlapped into when I was a gay guy, because I remember one of my boyfriends, when he was breaking up with me, just said, Joe, you are too needy, because I needed that all the time. And I think, unfortunately, these groups within the Catholic Church, some of them will attract those type of people. Yeah. And I'm not talking just like the conservative, I'm talking the more, and I want to get into a little conversation. Oh gosh, I've been talking for an hour with you. If we have time.
I will give you as much. You have graciously been on my show multiple times. You have as much time as you want.
Oh, okay. So thank you. So, I mean, there's certain young men that groups will go after.
Sure.
And predators will go after.
And there's definitely an overlap between those two. I don't know that they're necessarily identical. I never saw the profile of, what they looked at when they recruited young men, but they were very good at compartmentalizing information. It was only the people who needed to know certain things would know that stuff. Okay,
but let me ask you this too, because I mean, you were a young man.
Sure.
And you were in the LCs for a relatively short period of time.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, you didn't go through seminary and ordained and all that. Within these groups, in my experience, especially if you're in it for a while, even if you're on the periphery, that there's things going on that aren't cool. I mean, you figured it out as a young man. In a short period of time, you could see the manipulation,
right?
All that stuff. These people that stay, there's something in them, I think, that knows, and they stay. So I think there's a certain profile of a person that will get into a group like that, where there's abuse and there's types of things, and they stay in it.
I would love to know the answer to that, because I mean, it seems to me that confirmation bias and the blindness that comes with, believing that this organization has done so much good and there's no way that they can be doing this stuff. It reminds me of, how some of the victims of McCarrick had said, one of them said that, it might've been James Grine, said that the parents didn't believe him when he told them what the priest was doing, because there was no way. And furthermore, don't ever talk about a priest like that. I don't remember if it was him or somebody else, but this idea of the confirmation bias is so strong that a priest would never do something like this, and that we have to treat priests as another Christ and all this stuff. It is a powerful drug that blinds people to things that they don't want to see.
Especially if a priest has gone, and so the seminary training in the LCs is pretty rigorous. It's kind of like
it's very rigorous.
It's like the Jesuits. I mean, so they've got a lot of time, and I understand why they don't want to walk away.
But it's also a brainwashing process.
Exactly.
I mean, I remember talking to a priest one time about something that was going on that the Legionaries did that I didn't like. And my memory is getting worse and worse as I get older, but so I don't remember specifically what it was, but I remember him saying to me, yeah, I used to have a problem with that too. And over time, I came to see that it was just what we needed to do. And I remember thinking, again, I'm like 18, 19, and I looked at him, I'm like, you have been brainwashed into thinking something that is morally problematic is okay because you had to accept it in order to move on.
And I think a lot of that brainwashing takes place within spiritual direction and
Probably.
confession. I've written about this and talked about it, but when I was in the St. John group in Pennsylvania, I was having I was worried a lot about things that I saw there, because I saw things that it looked like grooming to me.
Mm-hmm.
And this was coming from an ex-gay guy who had a lot of experience.
Sure.
So, and I was confiding in my spiritual director and my confessor about my worries about these. Unbeknownst to me, he was an abuser, but I didn't know that at the time. But it was another priest, and he was manipulating me by saying, "Well, Joe, your past experiences as a priest sex abuse survivor and having a pretty hardcore life in gay, that's making you see this stuff. You tend to see things that are innocent, and you conflate them into grooming and abuse, and you know what I'm saying. You're like projecting all this stuff." And I was kind of like a damaged person anyway, although I was older, I was an adult. I was like, that makes sense. And I kept going with it and going with it and going with it.
I have the feeling that all of these predators are master psychological manipulators. They have to be.
It's like total gaslighting. So like by the time I left there, I thought I was completely nuts. I was like, I don't know if these priests are abusing young men. I don't know what's going on, until I actually talked to other people and said,
sure,
Joe, like I totally like sense the same thing. So I can see like people in the LCs where they see manipulation, they see all this stuff, brainwashing, gaslight, you name it. And it's a cult and you become mentally ill.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I feel like it's a matrix. It's a matrix thing, and they think that they're in reality, and they refuse to see it. I felt that very strongly when I would have these conversations with people on the inside when I was in college and I was trying to get them out, and they would just say things that were bizarre. Like I remember one young woman telling me the story, and I may have mentioned this in the podcast that you heard, about how there was a woman from the former Soviet bloc who had become involved with the Legionaries, and she was becoming a consecrated woman. And suddenly something struck her, and she said, this is like communism, the way you guys treat people and all. It reminds me of communism. And she was able to address these concerns to the founder, Father Maciel, and he said to her, according to this young woman, whether it's true or not, doesn't matter because it speaks to the thinking. Father Maciel, according to the story, said to her, yes, it is like communism, but with a good end.
Okay.
And I remember looking at this girl going, communism is objectively, intrinsically evil, right? There's no redemption of that, no matter what the end is. And she was just totally like, this was a great story that, Holy Father Maciel said this, and it assuaged this woman's conscience and made everything okay. Cult thinking is very hard to understand, how people become so blind to what's going on. It's very hard.
It attracts people that are already at a loss, I'd say. Now, I think your loss was kind of, well, I don't want to assess it for you, but your loss, maybe compared to mine, was a bit more minor. I mean, you did have some issues with your father, but still you're susceptible. Where mine was more, I'd say, severe, where I had experienced abuse and
absolutely. Yeah.
So people who are at a loss are susceptible to these groups, and it does become a home. For men, it does become a brotherhood. And when you mix it together with religion, it's really, really super hard.
And what we haven't discussed, and it may be on your agenda, but if people aren't familiar who are listening to this with the Legionaries and their story and how the biggest chapter of their story ended, Father Maciel, who founded this group and was treated like an absolute saint, was arguably the worst or one of the worst sexual predators in the history of clerical sexual abuse.
I was going to get to that.
And in my view, even though nobody I knew personally was ever abused by someone within the Legionaries, it was a culture designed to protect a predator.
Oof. The thing that really super frightened me, and I'm not frightened easily, but when I was reading about Maciel and his childhood and the severity of the abuse that he experienced, and James Grind talked about this with McCarrick, where McCarrick had experienced some like grooming with other priests, and it wasn't good. So how did this man become ordained and then rise with that kind of background?
Yeah.
I just and I experienced abuse as a kid. You can overcome it. It doesn't mean you're a monster your whole life if you've been abused. But I would say studies have shown it does make you more inclined to be an abuser.
Yeah.
Most people that abuse were themselves abused. That's just a fact.
There's something in our psychology. I mean, you can take it down. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse, emotional abuse. If you've been emotionally abused, you're much more likely to be an emotional abuser. It's a very common thing that we replay these things that we were subjected to.
Yeah, let me throw this out there. 46% of gay men experienced same-sex molestation as children, as compared to 7% of straight men. So, not all gay men are pedophiles. Not all gay men are predators. Not all gay men are ephemophobes, or whatever you want to call it. But there is a certain large amount of that going on in the gay community, just because almost half of them.
And you're not even allowed to say that, are you?
Oh, are you kidding? Because half of them were sexually abused.
But you saw this in your own life, that there was a subset of these guys. And I mean, you've told me before, that the fantasies about father-son relationships that exist in the gay community and everything, it's very strong. It's a very strong theme.
And a lot of these young men are drawn, and this is where I'm going to try to stitch everything together with you.
Okay.
A lot of these young men are drawn to the priesthood because I'm making an argument, I kind of made it in my book, that the gay male community and the priesthood offer somewhat similar things to young men who are at a loss. Because here you have the gay male community, it's a brotherhood, it's quite masculine. This image of the fairy doesn't really the most hyper masculine image is what's idolized in the gay community. That's very attractive. And then especially with some of these conservative groups, you have almost that same sort of image that I saw like in the LCs at Cheshire. It's quite a masculine, sort of Jesuit, old-time image of the priest. And that can be attractive to both of these.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's an archetypal image, and one of the most perplexing things to me is recognizing what a monster Maciel was. And obviously, it's come out more and more. Of the seminarians he abused, many of them went on to be priests and then continued to abuse.
Do you think this is a big scheme as it's like a gay cult? Is it a big scheme just for him to abuse people?
See, that's what I wish.
mean, he was attracting a certain kind of guy.
Yeah.
Maybe that he found attractive, and he's abusing them, and he's got this whole network around him. Because I think this does go on in the church. I think this does go on.
I mean, it's been hard for me since I've been gone, to go back and revisit. There's been more research done on him. Like the stuff you read about him being abused is not stuff I've actually seen. I think I've heard about it, but I didn't go back and read the books about him because I was just so done with that period of my life and the trauma that it caused and the betrayal that I felt from it. And it really hurt my faith for a long time. And at the same time, I mean, he was so ensconced in this mythos that they created about him. They literally would say he never said no to Christ. And they and they told this story, these stories about what you're talking about how did he get ordained. Well, they turned this into this heroic journey of perseverance where, one seminary kicked him out for some specious reason, and then another one did, and he wouldn't give up and kept going back. And in reality, what it probably was is they're all like, this guy's a sociopath. We're not going to let him be ordained here. And if his uncle hadn't been a bishop, it never probably would have happened. But his uncle made it happen.
He did.
And so, yeah, they've turned this whole thing on its head. And everything that he could have, had been accused of over the years was turned into just another stone in his martyrdom because he was such a holy man.
Yeah. If you don't mind, because I've been talking to you for over an hour, I want to switch gears here just a bit, and
Okay.
I want to talk about the Jesuits. Is that okay?
Sure. I know a lot less about them, but
the thing is that it seems like the LCs are sort of like a reformed offshoot of the Jesuits. I mean, it seemed like what I read, the education is very sort of,
I think they borrow and model from a lot of different things that they see. I mean, they did Ignatian retreats. That was a big thing that they did.
Okay.
So I think you're not wrong.
And it doesn't have a female corollary like the Franciscans or the Carmelites. It's just male.
Right. I mean, they have consecrated lay women, but they're lay women. They're not habited women. They're women who live in the world, and they're usually very attractive. And, they're this, again, it's this whole, they have this allure to the thing that they do.
Right. Now, to launch into this real quick, I'm going to try to do this quick. You're familiar with the movie The Exorcist, right?
Yes, although I am not a fan of those kind of movies. I've actually never watched it.
You're kidding. Oh my, have you read the book? Have you read the book?
No, I've seen real exorcisms, and that was enough for me.
Okay. Well, I went under deliverance, so
yeah.
The priest said that I was probably possessed. So, and I'm not a fan of the movie. I don't watch it a bunch of times.
Okay.
But I've seen it, and I have read the book. I really actually liked the book.
Okay.
But one of the things that in the movie that I found really interesting was these two priests. There's Father Damien Karras, who's the Jesuit, who actually exorcised. Well, he's the one that. Well, no. The demon sort of goes into him in the end. He doesn't successfully exorcise the demon, but he's the first priest that is assigned a case and that the mother of the possessed girl goes to. And then there's this other priest, Joseph Dyer, who's another Jesuit. And interestingly, that priest was played by an actual Jesuit priest. What was his name? Father William O'Malley.
Okay.
And he's been accused of just last year, he was accused of sexually abusing a young man.
Oh, wow.
Tell me about it. So these two priests, what I found interesting about it was in the beginning of the movie, because William Peter Blatty, the guy that wrote the book, was Lebanese Catholic, hard scrabble life. He's really interesting. He's passed away. Went to Georgetown on a scholarship, and towards the end of his life became very critical of the Jesuits and Georgetown, what was going on. Even appealed to the Vatican for them to step in, and then he passed away. But anyway, there's a scene in the movie where the priest, this Father Dyer, is walking through this corridor at Georgetown where the Jesuits are living, and there's like rock music playing. And this is 1973, which is the year of Roe v. Wade, and that was also the year that the DSM didn't include homosexuality.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, so that was a big year. So he's walking through these corridors, and like I said, there's rock music playing. There's a bunch of Jesuits in one of the rooms, playing poker, and they're drinking. It kind of looks like a fraternity or something.
Right.
There's nothing pious about it or anything. So he goes into Father Damien's room, and they're talking and blah, blah, blah. So I thought that was an interesting snapshot. And then there's another scene where Father Dyer, this Jesuit, is at the possessed girl's mother, her mother, and she was a movie star and very, very, international and, very, very, well-traveled and everything. So he's at this party, this priest, and he's playing the piano, and singing. Oh, I have a quote from the movie. This is a crazy quote. He's playing the piano. My idea of heaven is a solid white nightclub with me as the headliner for all eternity, and they love me. This is like, I know. Can you believe it?
Yeah,
So,
that's gross.
it is gross, isn't it? And he's very sort of effeminate. So, and then you have this Father Karras. He reminds me of a lot of the priests that helped me out when I was coming back to the church, because you tend to somebody in my situation who lives in the gay ghetto, lived a gay life, and you go into the gay Catholic church, you're going to meet like that Father Dyer, the guy with the piano, and you know, is very
Right.
kind of a failed actor, you know. So, but I met priests more like this Father Karras, you know, dark, somewhat broody, moody, and really having a difficult time in the church. That Father Dyer reminds me a lot of James Martin. And I think, yeah, but you know, that's the kind of performance art that really lends itself well to the Novus Ordo, I think too. It's a priest that has a big personality, is a bit of a failed actor.
Well, I mean, it's funny that you say that, because, you know, there's been all these accusations about Monsignor Rossi down at the Basilica in DC.
I've heard of him, yes. And I don't know much about his personality.
So I didn't know much about him, but I used to live in the DC area, and my wife and I, when we were not married yet, we were still dating, we would routinely take trips down to the Basilica. We would go down to confession. We'd often go to mass there. And I didn't even know who he was at the time, which is interesting. Actually, I remember when Bransfield was the rector. He's now been accused of a whole bunch of stuff. He ended up becoming the bishop of Wheeling, and then was accused. Now, Rossi, who was his successor, was the rector. And I remember going to mass, and he offered the mass, and his diction and his manner and everything that he did. And I think I turned to my wife and I said, it's like an off Broadway production.
Way off.
You know, it was so, I don't know. I don't know. It was campy.
Yeah.
And I had no idea there was anything wrong with the guy. I didn't make that connection. I just couldn't understand the melodrama that's put into the way everything is enunciated, and the pauses and the cadence. And I was like, can you just offer mass? Is that a thing that you could maybe do?
Probably not. Yeah. No, because he's the center of everything. But
he's not Father James Martin, S.J.
No, I love the way you say that.
I know, I did that just for you.
I know, thank you very much. But I mean, when I look at the Jesuits and I see what the type of guy they're attracting, it seems to be that type of priest who's at a cocktail party, at a piano, you know, playing show tunes, being a big fat ham. It seems like that's the kind of priest they're attracting. And it's the same kind, I think, of young man who's at a loss.
Yeah.
But is finding something within the Jesuits, a brotherhood, completely different, not the masculine type of brotherhood.
Yeah.
It's strange. It's almost like
it's weird.
It's like a gay sort of celibacy. It's very over the top. It's very strange. I can't figure it out. I thought maybe you.
No, I mean, it makes me wonder why my experience of the Legionaries was actually very different, because here you had this. I mean, he wasn't just a homosexual predator. You know, Father Maciel had children with multiple women, and then he abused them too.
He was an opportunistic predator.
Yes,
who just kind of preyed upon whoever was there. And
equal opportunity abuser, I guess. But mostly it was men. And I think that I believe that the last count I saw is I think at least 63 legionaries were victims of his molestation. So it wasn't a few. But I never had a sense of there being this effeminacy.
No.
In the priests that I met there, most of them were just dudes, you know. I mean, I never felt uncomfortable around them. They weren't like that. You know, I can't recall a single legionary priest or even seminarian that I met that gave me any kind of a gay vibe or anything like that. They were just normal guys. And I think many of them really were. And so I don't know if there was a genius in using that to shield what was going on at the core of the thing.
Exactly.
It's very strange that this culture could be built around this guy who was doing this stuff, and you don't see the exact scene you're describing in the Jesuits. You would almost think that it would draw them, maybe. I don't know.
Because when I went to Cheshire, I thought, this is not gay. This doesn't seem
Right.
gay to me. But when I've been
And
around,
I trust your gaydar more than mine,
okay.
Joseph.
So when I never met Marcel, of course, and I know LC priests, and they're good, and I find them to be holy men. Um, um, but when I've been around the Jesuits, yeah, the gaydar is just like off. It's just like off. It's like off the scale.
I
So
think Maciel, I never met him. I was in his presence once at a mass, and I think he was more of a monster than anything. There was nothing benign at all about him. He wasn't, I don't know if he was a charismatic man to anyone, but I was enamored of the idea. I was enamored of the idea of him at that time because I had been led to believe that he was like the next best thing to the Pope, and he was a saint and all this stuff. But when I think back on seeing him, the man had a dead face and dead eyes, and there was just something about him that wasn't right. And I don't know if you've ever read the story of his deathbed, but it's a terrifying. He was unrepentant to the end. He refused confession and last rites. They were looking at getting an exorcist. They didn't know what to do. He wanted nothing to do with God's mercy or grace at the end of his life, according to the reports that came out of that room.
It's interesting because he himself was not an attractive man. I've seen pictures.
No, he was really an ugly man. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Himmler in Nazi Germany, who was not an attractive man, but had these blonde SS guys around him.
I mean, when Maciel was younger, he was a fairly average looking guy, who I guess you could say he cleaned up well, but the older he got, the more of a monster he looked like.
Yeah. So these, I have to say, these sort of men, these sort of predatory men, I don't know what kind of traction they would get in the gay male community. I don't think they would get a lot just because of their appearance. But and I have found that to be so with the Jesuits. I have found that, I had been molested by a Jesuit priest, and those priests are quite effeminate. And I think it would be a big turnoff in the gay male community.
So do you think this is why it's happening?
I think their last bastion is the Catholic Church.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, where they can't find. It's kind of like the LCs were just a big scheme for this predatory psychopath to have handsome, vulnerable young men around him who he could manipulate and then abuse.
And the money and power to do whatever he wanted without accountability. We know these predators are always narcissists. The Legionaries had billions. I don't even know what their total assets are, but they are incredibly wealthy.
I would say that was like icing on the cake. I don't know the man, but I think knowing predators, I think the power that they have over other people is really what they're after.
And he had both. The man had the power to pay off cardinals or whoever he wanted. He had the personal and relentless approval of Pope John Paul II, which they used as a shield for as long as they could possibly get mileage out of it. Every time
other priests are doing this as well because they have seeming approval of Pope Francis.
Yeah, and so they'll say, "Oh well, he loves us," so and you're like, "Well, that's not an answer to the criticism that I just made," but they treat it as though it is.
Yeah, and then I wanted to maybe in conclusion or try to wrap things up. Because in your video, you talked about how people that are still involved with the LCs, how they can stay.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of posed that question to those people. And it's legitimate. And I know LC priests, like I said, I feel like they're healthy and they're good men and they're holy men. I guess because I don't have any personal involvement, I guess I'm giving them the time to process what's happened. Like you said, some of it's still fairly new.
Yeah, but they've had over a decade to come to terms with this.
Okay, no, I get it. I get it. I get it. I get it, Steve. Um, and they've been in it a long time, so
Yeah,
they're terribly invested. I don't know, where they are psychologically, so it's difficult. So I think it's valid for you to make that to ask that question, why are you still in there? But I've also asked it of the Jesuits, who have a much longer
sure.
history of manipulation, outright lying, heresy, and but nobody, like, when I've asked, just a general question about the Jesuits, why is a Jesuit, why are you still in there? I mean, they had the largest payout of any religious order in the Catholic Church, hundreds of millions of dollars. They have a long history of, manipulating the LGBT community, convincing people that they're gay, telling young people they don't know if that young man has been abused, telling people they're gay, all this stuff, brainwashing, and then having all of these LGBT ministries where they draw people in. It kind of sounds like, the LCs again, drawing people in into these communities, overseen by priests who I don't know what their backgrounds are, but they're involved in all of this stuff with young people. I don't think a good Jesuit, and any of the good Jesuits I know, I don't know how they can stay in that organization,
I
which
can't
is
imagine,
which
or
is
why it continues to attract new people.
which is so corrupt. Well, that's what I'm worried about, because what kind of people are attracted? Are they predatory? I don't know. Why would you go into the Jesuits with their history
I can't imagine.
of predation?
Or just, I mean, even if you took predation off the table, which is hugely significant, I
Yeah.
don't know how, you look and just see how ragingly heterodox they are. What about that appeals to, as you say, the man who becomes the good Jesuit? How do you, I don't know. In my
They
opinion,
must
both
have a
orders, both
they must
orders
have
just
a
need to be suppressed. It's time.
thank
Let's
you.
suppress them.
They must just have a huge ego. If you've got a Jesuit going in there going, well, I'm going to change
Yeah.
the society of Jesus from within. Oh, really?
Good
Oh,
luck.
really? Hey, a saint could do it, but I don't know. You must have a huge ego to go into
Yeah.
something like that and think that's a possibility. And in the meantime, while you're changing this sick, corrupt institution from within, how many people are still being abused while you're doing whatever you're doing from within this organization?
It occurs to me talking
I
about all this that uh, I just, I wish people could take away from this something that the Legionnaires used to always say, and this is a little bit of a mystery. They would use this in their own defense. They said that a good tree can't produce bad fruit. That's what our Lord said, and they would use it constantly and say, "Look at all of the good fruit that we produce." And they did. They did some good stuff. They had some good people. They helped some people become really holy. I mean, there was stuff that they did that was good, but there was a lot of bad fruit too. And I think that there's this mentality within Catholicism, within the more traditional and conservative sides of Catholicism, that almost has a very difficult time believing that these good orders, or at least that appear good, that appear to be doing orthodox things, that appear to be reverent about the Blessed Sacrament, that do all this stuff that Catholics should do if they're on the path to holiness, are either somehow immune from predation, or are
oh,
uh, I don't even know.
yeah.
I would like to believe they're less likely. I don't know if they're significantly less likely, only because they're self-selecting. These people who choose to do these things that are above and beyond what the average Catholic does
Yeah.
tend to select down into people who have a more consistent prevalence of belief and devotion and sacramental life and all that stuff. And so, yeah, generally speaking, it's probably a less of an incident, but
Yeah.
it's not non-existent. And
No,
for
not at all.
me, from my perspective, I was drawn into this cult founded by this monster because I was looking for the exact things that these people think are going to protect them. And instead, they were used like lures to bring people in.
Yeah, there's a dark side of this too, and let me flip it for you, because I mean I'm around more liberal Catholics than I am conservative,
Sure.
unfortunately. And using this seamless garment, they'll use the same argument with like the Jesuits or like the Franciscan miners. Oh, gee, they help the poor. They provide all these things for the homeless, and they do all these wonderful good things. How could they prey on young people? It's that same thing, except
Yeah.
that, like, where you're saying, oh, look at these guys, everything is liturgically correct, they say the right things, they wear a cassock, they wear the right liturgical color, it's
Right.
okay. But these guys over here, they do all this social justice stuff. How could they prey upon people? A lot of times that is a cover.
Sure.
Cover. That, just the way the social justice stuff in the Jesuits can be a cover, this stuff can be a cover as well. And I talk about this with certain bishops, where they'll waft some incense and throw some Latin your way
Yep.
sometimes. And
And
everybody's like,
people are
oh,
so desperate for that
they're the
that
good
they
guys.
fall all over themselves. It's like a scrap from the table, and that doesn't make this guy amazing. Our standards are unbelievably low right now.
But a lot of those people that defend these groups aren't ones like you or I who've seen it from within.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've seen a lot of these dioceses and stuff from within, and I see, okay, no, there's other stuff going on there underneath this thin veneer of orthodoxy, or underneath this veneer of social justice. There's other things going on there. Because for a lot of these gay men, like I said, I hate to say it, but for a lot of men that would not fit into the gay male community for whatever reason, I think they end up in the Catholic priesthood.
That is a terrifying thought, but unfortunately, it does appear to be the case.
Okay, this is my last question. I know, I think I know what you're going to say. Do you think that the Legionnaires of Christ? I don't think the Jesuits can be reformed. I mean, they have a saint as their founder. I just think that from top to bottom, it's so rotten, it's
Right.
so perverse, it's so sadistic, it's so sick, that I think it just needs to be shut down. And years from now, who knows? Somebody might pick up, the work of Saint Ignatius and say, hey, let's start over. Do you think that the Legionnaires of Christ can be reformed?
Not a chance.
Wow.
It's impossible. You cannot have a sadistic monster as a founder who was foundational to the pedagogy of the formation of many of the priests who are still involved at high levels with this order. How do you build a foundation not on sand but on like putrid garbage? There's nothing there. There is no charism that this movement has. The only reason they still exist is because they're rich. That's my opinion. They were too rich and too powerful to be shut down. And they should have been. It's a disservice not only to the church and everybody that they're going to continue to lure in, but to the men who are on the inside who actually are good and deserve to be somewhere where they can be sanctified and be a part of something holy and good. So yeah, no, I don't think they can.
Okay. And lastly, too, the name of my podcast is Finding Our Father. And I think if fathers in general, and fathers cannot stop every evil in the world. It's just impossible. We have a fallen nature. But I think to a large degree, I think fathers, if they're involved with their sons, caring, are compassionate, I think boys are not going to be manipulated by any of these groups, whether it's the LCs, whether it's the LGBT community, whether it's the Jesuits. I just think if fathers do their part, there's not going to be boys walking around who feel lost and lonely and are open to manipulation.
Thank you for always beating that drum, because as a father, I know that I have often fallen short of that, and I get too caught up in work and in other things, and I'm not present enough. And it's something that I'm really trying to work on, because the time goes by and then it's gone, and you think you had time to do it and you don't. And we need to be reminded of this.
But at least you admit it,
Yeah, I do know. I'm not proud of it, but I know.
Hey, God bless you, Steve. Thank you so much. But you guys spent an hour and a half with me. Thank you. So
I'm
I
just
hope,
so easy to talk to. You can't help it.
but I mean, the purpose of this podcast, I hope we helped some people. Just watch out, be wary. Watch your kids.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's come out of all of this mess, and you suffered, we suffered, I suffered, we all suffered, is that I think good parents are more wary of anything in Catholicism. I don't care if it is a TLM. I think they are. I just think they might investigate. Whereas I think certainly when I was a kid, I ended up in a parked car with a priest. I think that wasn't anything that anybody would have thought about. But now, my gosh.
I mean, unfortunately, it's gone completely the other way, where we can't even trust priests that we love. Right. And I hate that feeling, because I didn't grow up that way. Well, my personal nature is not inclined not to trust people. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I hate being cynical and suspicious. But our generation cannot afford to not be that way.
And that is not the priest's fault. That's the fault of the bishops. They did not oversee, just like somebody like Maciel never should have been ordained.
Yeah, there's too many cases of people we thought were good who were not. And I know you're trying to end the show, but I mean, I know another Jesuit, by the way. You probably may have heard the story, Father Donald Maguire.
Yeah.
Who, I mean, he fooled everybody up to and including Mother Teresa.
Yep.
One of my best friends was married by this guy. He was his spiritual director his entire life. And this is a guy who has 8 brothers, and they were all under his tutelage, and not one of them experienced even a hint of impropriety. Now, granted, this family is the kind of guys that, if you had done something to them, your body probably would have wound up out in the desert, torn into pieces. But they're really good at selecting who they pick. And then they have these great families that they totally trick with sound spiritual advice and all this stuff. I mean, my friend had a lot of good advice that helped him become a man from this priest who was abusing vulnerable guys who had father issues.
Exactly.
And how do they do both? How is it possible to do both? So you can't look at somebody and say, look how good they are, look how much benefit they've brought to my family, and then just assume that means that they are who they say they are. And that is a terrifying thing. That is a master stroke of the devil.
I mean, at 29 years old, at the experience that I had, I mean, I had been sexually abused. I'd been in the gay community. I mean, I'd been around predation my whole life. I got fooled. And I did. So because some people say, oh my gosh, these seminarians in the Legionnaires of Christ or whatever, or in the Society of St. Pius X, how on earth were they sexually abused and they're not gay or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
I know how it happens. You get manipulated, and it just happens. It happens. The ones that they don't make headway with, they just kind of move aside. And the ones that they can keep, gaslighting.
And they get them into a position where even if it's not something that they wanted to have happen, they feel so guilty about it that they won't say anything.
And then they use it against you. I don't want to end with this, but when I was called to testify, against the Society of St. John, all of this stuff came out in the cross-examination that the priest had revealed from spiritual direction and confession about my past in homosexuality and all of this stuff.
So he was profiling you.
And yes, and they used it against you. So I can see how some people are scared to leave, like maybe the Legionnaires of Christ or whatever, because they don't know what is going to be revealed about them. It's scary. It's scary.
Yeah, it is.
So I hate to end it on that. Let's end it on a good note. I don't know how, but let's just pray for good bishops. I know we have good priests. I hate to say the bishops still don't get it. I've talked with so many bishops. I think to their credit, they have kind of cleaned out the pedo priests. That was pretty easy to do, you would think. Priests that are luring little kids and molesting them. The part that they have not cleaned out is the predatory priests that still remain, that are preying on seminarians and who are preying on other priests. I got to tell you, this is a whole other show. I have heard from priests who have been preyed upon by other priests, and they don't know what to do about it because they informed the bishop. It is absolute, Steve, it's absolute madness. This is the stuff that's going on in the church. I would say they have cleared out the pedo, not because of anything that they did or they're brave or courageous, but because they all got sued. But they haven't cleaned up priests who are preying on other priests, preying upon seminarians, and preying upon especially young, vulnerable LGBT people. Because they convince these young people, it's a form of grooming, it's a form of brainwashing. They convince these young people that they were born gay, that God made them gay. And there's this whole other cult around all this stuff. The bishops need to break it up, but I just don't see them doing it. They don't even acknowledge that there's a problem.
They're afraid, I'm sure. I'm sure they're afraid of what the ramifications of that will be for them because, you know, they're politicians and this is not the politically correct thing to do.
No.
All I know is
ended on a good note. For me.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you.
Okay.
I want to thank you because I know you've been through hell and back, and not just from the life before, but everything that's happened in the last few years. And you are relentless in trying to get this message out that so few people are willing to hear. And I just respect you and admire you so much for, you know, you could leave all this trauma behind and do something different and not think about it anymore, which is what most people want to do when they leave a traumatic situation. And instead you just keep marching right back into the mouth of hell and saying, I'm going to do my best to save as many of these people or bring them to God as I can. I'm going to bring this to the attention of the bishops. I'm not going to stop. You're a soldier.
Yeah. People, thank you very much. People ask me like, like wasn't gay porn, like, BDSM. Oh, that must have been like really horrible. That was like hell. I was like, you know, yeah, it wasn't good, but that was easy compared to the 20 years I've had in the Catholic Church. I have
that puts it into perspective.
People in the Catholic Church than I ever met in that world, ever. Because a lot of those people don't know what they're doing is wrong. I'm not making excuses for them, but a lot of them have had trauma, abuse, everything. The priests in the Catholic Church who I've met are just plain evil.
I have failed to help you end this on a positive note.
but you know that. You know.
I know.
You were in a group founded by an evil person.
I was.
Who found shelter in the Catholic Church. So I don't know. Clean up, guys. Clean up. Sorry.
It's okay.
But thank you, Steve. The hope all ended in a helpful note. The hope in the Catholic Church, I don't see from the Pope. I don't see from the bishops. I see some from some priests. Oh, they've been so persecuted and beaten down. I don't know how they survive. I see it from Catholic fathers and Catholic laymen who say enough is enough is enough. And I see them speaking out more and more and more. And that's where it's gonna turn the corner.
I think you're probably right.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you so much for having me on.